talking about a bill that, if passed, would give truck drivers overtime. John, thanks for joining us this morning.
Sure, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
Excellent stuff. Let's dig into this. What is in this bill?
Yeah, well, and a little quick background, Michael. So the Federal Labor Standards Act, it has this overtime pay carve out, basically, for it's an exemption for anyone who's employed by a trucking company that drives interstate. So it basically means trucking companies aren't required to pay overtime. Now, the intent of this exemption, when it was put in place back in the 1930s, was actually, it was a safety reason. They said it was to prevent the purpose behind it was to prevent drivers from taking on too many hours, so that they don't drive while they're tired. But since the 30s, as we know, things have changed. I mean, the industry has evolved to where, not only do most companies, they're not paying by the hour, number one, but also the hours of service rules have gradually been relaxed. So now you can drive. Because they've figured out, okay, you can safely, if you put rest breaks here and you put restrictions there, you can safely drive more than 40 hours. So you can drive up to 60 hours now, like over seven days. So basically, the bill introduced by Andy Levin, a Democrat from Michigan, back in April, it's called the Guaranteeing Overtime Truckers Act, and it's probably the shortest bill I've ever seen. It basically just 3 lines. It just says requires Section 13B of the Fair Labor Standards Act to be amended by striking paragraph 1. So that's all the bill says. So if you go to paragraph 1 in the FSLA, that's where it relates to the overtime exemption for motor carriers. So Levin said basically that, so aside from alleviating the churn in trucking, where we see this 90% number in the long haul sector all the time of driver turnover, it would also improve safety, because drivers would be less likely to speed or drive while they're tired, because ostensibly once they hit the 40 hour mark, they'd start getting paid overtime on the clock. So and he also mentioned that it could also help drive supply chain efficiencies, and his point there was that because drivers would be guaranteed overtime pay, it would help incentivize shippers and receivers to keep trucks moving through the supply chain at the warehouse, and they wouldn't be detained as much, with the implication being that the cost would be, the overtime, the added cost for the carriers would be passed down to them. So this would be sort of an incentive for them to keep things moving too. So he put a bunch. So those were kind of the support reasons that he had for the bill.
John, I've got to wonder, in the industry, who is saying yes to this? Who's the lobby on the yes side, and who's the lobby on the no side behind this?
Yeah, well, OWIDA, the owner-operators, have been for this for a while. They've been pushing this for a long time. So it was OWIDA, the Teamsters Union is supporting it, and also the Truck Safety Coalition and a couple of other of the truck safety groups. I asked ATA actually a couple of weeks ago. I asked ATA for their official response to it, and I didn't hear back from them. But I asked the Chamber of Commerce. They said that they're not taking a position on it right now. But I would suspect that the Chamber of Commerce and ATA's position would be the same as the National Industrial Transportation League, which this week, and this is why this kind of bubbled up again. This week, they said in their highway committee meeting that they actually highlighted this as one of the pieces of legislation that they're kind of tracking. They basically said, this would drive up costs for, they would quash it immediately if it were to get legs, which there's not a whole lot of indication that it would, but if it were, they would put it down immediately. So it's basically, the independent drivers and the safety groups against big business, basically, in this fight, basically.
Gotcha. It's very interesting. Right. I appreciate everything that you've brought to light here, Thomas. Any thoughts on this, on what it's presenting to both shippers and carriers?
Well, it depends on who you ask, really. If you're a driver, you're definitely going to want to get paid overtime because you're going to be driving 70 hours a week if possible, and oftentimes with inefficiencies in the supply chain, you're not going to get paid. What this means for shippers and carriers, though, is things will get more expensive. And so that's going to be the biggest challenge, is that in the event this does pass and we do allow drivers to get paid a form of overtime, it kind of throws a wrench in the get paid per mile driven concept that's been around since at least deregulation, because trucking used to be heavily unionized and very much concentrated prior to the 80s. And so going to be a very interesting thing. If you're a large carrier customer, obviously you don't want to pay drivers overtime because you're used to having to pass off inefficiencies. Oh, you can't drive 500 miles today, it's 400 miles. I only pay you for 400 miles. Your wasted time is just dissipated, gone. And so, the Congress people, just like California's AB 5, they're thinking, hey, this doesn't seem very fair. And so you see talks of this kind of regulation.
So Thomas, I've got to wonder, we talk a lot about drivers finding that extra bit of time and they could be just a little bit more efficient. I think it's the MIT study that's like 18 more minutes makes all the difference, right? But how does that find extra time now fit in with pay overtime? If drivers aren't truly using all of the time that they're allotted to drive, there's a lot of time spent in detention, a lot of times waiting in lines. You've seen those videos. I think it's at the Port of LA. You guys talk about it on What the Truck, of those lines just backed up, sure, one after another of trucks trying to get into the port. Where does that kind of fit in with this?
Well, it really just depends on your hours of service, what we define as on-duty time or off-duty time. And so currently, you're getting paid per mile, your driving time. And Dr. David Carell and the excellent team at MIT talked about how that driving time is what's being wasted, and it's being used as either off-duty or on-duty time and dissipated. So if we sped it up, the issue becomes if a driver now becomes paid per mile, he's going to be more incentivized to say, oh, I'm chilling out in traffic, on-duty time. I'm waiting at a dock, on-duty time. I'm eating my breakfast bagel, on duty time. And so the enforcement mechanism will be extremely difficult because currently, like you said, because of wasted time, drivers will kind of skirt around the corners and place themselves off duty. I'm not working to save up my time and use later. Or sleeper berth, I'm hiding in the bunk. And so that opens up a whole new can of worms as if we start paying by the hour and we remove the per mile, or we use something like guaranteed, which some companies do, it could cause costs to significantly rise across the board. Carriers now have to pay much more for labor. They pass it off on to shippers. Shippers have to pay a lot more for transportation costs. Hence, you see why both large carriers and shippers do not like this.
It's interesting, John mentioned that if this gets legs, there'll be some big fights. Will it get legs?
Drivers, I don't think it will, because the large business interests will effectively lobby Congress to kill it, unfortunately. But if you are a small carrier, that is a very interesting thing, especially in the American political system. We have millions of drivers on the road. It is by far, in certain states, the largest amount of employed people, in parts of the supply chain. But, for the past few decades, they have not been able to effectively, unless you see the Canadian protests and some of the 1970s and 80s style shutdowns, they've not been able to leverage this bargaining power. So until you see drivers effectively mobilize and do such a thing, and I'm not talking about let's take a day trip to DC, I'm talking about let's shut down a highway, then you won't really get that bargaining power. And the problem is the industry itself, while it's beneficial for large carriers, it does not encourage any form of collective bargaining, the big bad U word that they don't want anyone to talk about. And so, it's going to be a situation where until that changes, until drivers get this bargaining power and collective voice, continue to expect things where we're going to hear about it. But the closest thing we have to a real threat is California's AB 5 when talking about the independent contractor status. Now, if that ends up getting some legs and the Supreme Court declines to look at it, another huge pillar of the trucking model will actually get taken out, just because due to so much competition in the space. Carriers will utilize contractors because they save money. They increase every independent owner-operator on my board was just extra money in terms of margin. He didn't buy health insurance. 40% of all drivers don't have health insurance when they ask them at truck stops, and it still hasn't changed. So, you know, the company's not paying for that. They have to pay for their own truck, and they're making profit off of it. So depends on who you ask. If I'm a driver, definitely want to get that sweet, sweet overtime. If I'm a large carrier or a shipper, I'm starting to sweat.
So the representative who's championing this bill says that he's got some decent bipartisan support for it so far. We're looking at about 7 Dems, 1 Republican, 8 co-sponsors. And we're heading into the midterm elections. 2022 is an election year. Do you think that this type of champion for the supply chain, now that it's in such visible light, is going to be a key player in those midterm elections, and seeing where people sit on either side of these bills like this could be possibly a determining factor in election status?
If they put it up to vote, it could be really useful. I mean, what you want to do politically in this instance is you don't want to pass too much before midterms, so you want to get a vote. If you know it's going to fail, that way you can at least point your fingers in your campaign attack ads and say, haha, you didn't vote for overtime rules, I got you, vote for me instead. And so we're seeing a lot of political posturing in that regards, especially recently the Democrats did one with formula. They put in a rider, and by simply voting against it, you get free fodder. Pay close attention to the theater, because each side is positioning it. I mean, you have one co-sponsor that's Republican, 7 of them are Democrats. You know, it's right now, I guess the key thing is we're seeing a lot of buzz about it. Whether this goes anywhere, I'm highly doubtful, just because there's not a lot of incentive for congressional people to upend the transportation and supply chain after they're getting yelled at for port delays and other issues.
Fair enough.
It's also very hard for an owner-operator to force himself to pay himself overtime. So it's going to be difficult.
Sure.
All right, Thomas, thank you for that. You'll be back with us in a little bit to talk about AB 5, and we'll be back with our roundtable today as well. Right now, we're going to head over to the wall. We've got our first carrier update of the morning.